Hello YouTube, I'm Liz. Welcome to my video. Today I'm going to be showing how I created a watercolor palette with Marie's watercolor paints as a gift for my niece's birthday. First, I'm going to talk about what it exactly means to create a palette. There are actually two common uses for this word for artists. The first is describing the actual surface upon which an artist will put their paints. An example is this photo here, which shows a traditional wooden palette with the thumb hole cut out that an artist like, say, Bob Ross or Monet would have carried. This is a traditional artist palette. In researching this video, I found an article that I'm going to link below with a description of a library in New York run by an art society that actually has a collection of American artist palettes in their building, which I thought was pretty neat. So go ahead and check that out online. Next, we have a traditional, or as opposed to a traditional palette, this is a modern palette. This is what my Marie's palette looks like, with the colors arranged from yellow to purple on the top and then white off to the bottom so it won't get contaminated, then rose to black. This is the palette that I've selected for my niece. It is also a modern plastic palette that you can open and close and keep her paints nice and secure. It includes 20 wells up along the side and the bottom there, and then 5 large flat mixing areas to create new shades of paint, as well as a thumb hole like that traditional wooden palette, and a few places right there to hang your brushes if that's what you wanted to do, and that's how it looks in your hand, taken on the go. The other use for the word palette for artists is the actual selection of colors that an artist would put on the plastic or wooden surface. So in this case, the palette is a selection of 18 colors that came in a Marie's set. These aren't colors I picked that came in the set, but it is a good variety of reds and yellows and blues and some earth tones for mixing. So I didn't really change those colors. The physical palette, the plastic palette, has 20 wells. So I decided to add an additional 2 colors, that quinacridone magenta and a yellow-green from my Turner set. These are artist quality, so there's pigment information and light fastness information for these. All right, so that's it for the palette. Let's talk about supplies. On the left, you'll see one of my palettes with a color chart behind a clear plastic mixing area, and onto the right, all of the wells with chromatically arranged beautiful watercolors. On the right here, or in the middle rather, you will see my niece's palette yet to be filled, but there are 20 wells, and I'm going to go ahead and fill those all the way up for her so she has a lot of paint to play with. I'm also going to create a color chart, so she'll have a sample of what those colors will look like on paper. I thought it'd be cute to do them in little hearts, so you'll see me attempt one at the top with wonky shaped hearts, and then I made a template for the bottom. And first I just kind of measured out how much space I would have for the color chart, and then I drew it up. Here are the supplies you will need for the palette pour. You will of course need some kind of palette. In my case, I'm using a plastic palette that I purchased at Daiso for my niece with 20 wells, and I will of course need 20 watercolors to match. In my case, I'm using the Marie's Fine watercolors that I purchased online from Jerry's Art-A-Rama. You can of course use whatever watercolors you have. I'm trying to make an affordable gift, so all I purchased for this was the palette, and I'm using watercolors that I already had on hand. Optional is a cute collectible Star Wars tin, but highly recommended, of course. You're also going to need a tissue or a paper towel of some kind to dab up some mistakes, a Q-tip for the same reason, dabbing up mistakes, and some kind of stylus or mixing tool. I'm just using a plain old toothpick. Sometimes the binder comes out if that watercolor is separated from the pigment, and you have to give it a good stir. For the drawing portion of the chart and palette pour, I'm going to be using a clear plastic ruler, in this case a quilter's ruler, which conveniently has a bunch of horizontal lines that are going to help me line up the little grid that I'm making to place those hearts nice and evenly spaced on the color chart. Obviously you don't have to use this, you can use any kind of ruler, but a clear ruler with lines on it definitely helps. Some other tools you're going to need are, of course, a pencil. I am using a 2H pencil because for watercolor you want really fine, delicate lines that are going to be easier to erase so that you don't see them through the painting. In this case, it is an H pencil, so you want to draw it a little bit lightly, but it's easier to erase that way because the lines are lighter to begin with. I've also got a eraser, well-used eraser. Just make sure you've tested it on your paper to make sure it doesn't smear or leave any kind of undesired mark. I'm also using a Sharpie. It's one of my favorite drawing tools for watercolor. I use it all the time. And an Epiphany XB Chrome in the 5 nib size. Again, both of those have been tested on watercolor paper before so that I know they don't bleed or cause any undesired effects. For the paper, I'm using a 140-pound Arteza cold press watercolor cellulose paper. It's got a really lovely texture to it. It does look machine made. It's not a hand-made paper look, but it's very convenient. And so that's what I'm going to be using for the drawing supplies. A clear ruler, watercolor paper, pencil and eraser, and some pens, all of which you've tested beforehand to make sure they work. Okay, here is everything set up for the palette pour. I have all my paints arranged in a chromatic scale. The way the palette was laid out, there was this nice little 5-well area over here that worked perfectly for the earth tones, and then 3 areas for the blues, which is exactly the amount of blues that came in that set, and all the other colors arranged on the larger part of the palette. There are 2 additional colors. There is a Turner Magenta, quinacridone magenta, and a Turner, what does that say? Yellow-green. That makes sense. So, those are the 2 colors I added to the Marie's palette. Here is a color chart that I did before with all the Marie's colors. What's included is a rose, a crimson red, a vermilion, orange yellow, gamboge, lemon yellow, sap green, and green light, green deep, cerulean deep, Prussian blue, ultramarine blue, Marie's violet, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber. The 2 that I did not swatch out here are the white and the black. I figured I didn't need samples of those, and I don't use those particular colors too often, but I'm going to go ahead and include everything just because the palette had 20 wells and I wanted to use up all that paint. I added these 2 colors specifically because I thought the set could maybe use another green, another color in between these 2, and it also didn't have anything in between this rose and the violet, and I figured that would be a good color. It probably doesn't necessarily need the green, it probably needs another blue, but there were these 3 wells over here, and I just wanted to leave those with the blues so that it would look pretty when it's all finished. And my niece is going to enjoy it regardless of what colors are missing. She won't know, and she's going to have fun with this amazing range of colors. The Marie's paints are really great. They're a lot of fun to play with. Here is my Marie's palette. It's a little bit smaller, physically smaller, than the one that I'm giving my niece. But this one was a Reeves palette, I believe, that I purchased on Amazon when they were on sale. They are no longer at such a discount. They're about twice the price, and for the price that they're at now, a little over $5, I don't think it's worth it. When I got them, they were much cheaper. But this is what I use for my Marie's paints. I have another one for my Turners, and I have another one for some M-gram colors specifically as a mixing palette. But it's got all my colors, again, arranged in a mostly chromatic way with the white over here so it wouldn't get contaminated. The current one I'm using was purchased for only $1.50 at a store called Daiso. I will put the links in the description box. They're not affiliate links. I'm not affiliated with anyone yet. Just to help you find these materials. If you have a Daiso in your area, check it occasionally because these were not in the store the first few times I looked for watercolor supplies. They had a good selection of brushes. Occasionally they'll have some calligraphy paper that might be worth playing with just to see what the properties of it are. But they did not have these palettes, and for $1.50, it's a really sturdy plastic. It's really thick. It is a bit bigger than my previous Reeves palette, so as far as traveling, tucking in a notebook, the littler palettes are a bit more convenient. But the big one is a nice sturdy plastic, and I think it's going to be great for my niece for her project. Now that the palette pour is done and I can wait for it to dry, I'm measuring out the length and the width of my niece's palette so that I have the proper dimensions to draw a color chart for that space and attach it to the outside when I'm finished. It's important to use the same kind of paper that I'm giving to my niece or that you might be using in your practice when you make your color chart so that you get the most accurate results. If you usually use Arch paper, you should make your color chart on that rather than something cheap, just because the color results would be more accurate if you use the paper you normally used to. Now here I am drawing a bunch of lines. First, marking the width, same as I measured on the palette, and now the length, same as I measured on the actual palette. For my niece's palette, I had to do this little bit of measuring. For my palette, it came with that clear plastic drop-in tray, and I was able to just trace around that, which made this step quite a bit easier. But you'll have to adjust depending on what kind of palette and materials you're working with. There I am drawing the width. Now I've switched to a pencil because I am going to be painting on the inside of this rectangle on the top left there. So everything inside there's going to be in very light pencil marks that I plan to erase before I start actually painting. I'm checking to make sure I've got the right dimensions and drawing a bunch of lines here. The plan is to do rows of hearts in the various colors, so I'm just drawing the little, I remember if I used boxes and put the hearts inside the boxes, or if I put the hearts on the intersection of the lines. Either way, I did a quick little bit of math and realized that there are going to be 21 hearts, or 21 little color swatches, in my case hearts, despite the fact there are 20 paints. So this was just the easiest way to do it mathematically. 3 lines or 3 rows rather, and then 7 columns. And hearts on each of those. And then for this last one, I initially thought I would do a metallic gold just because I had some gold paint and I wanted to play around and use that. In the second chart that I redo, because I ended up doing 2 copies, you can see the hearts in this one are pretty wonky. I wanted to make it look a little bit nicer, so I fixed those. But in this one I used a gold paint, and the second one I decided to leave that off because I wasn't including that with the paints. Okay, here is my paper, my Arteza paper, ready to paint or almost ready to paint, my color swatch sampler for my niece's palette. What I did yesterday was, based on the same measurements that I used for the Oops one up above, I used this ruler and I measured out an 8-inch by 3 3/4 inch square. I gridded it out every inch along this long stretch and every 1.25 inches horizontally, and it created this little grid for all these little hearts. Now, because I did a practice, I realized I did not like the variety of hearts, some of which look much better than others, so I decided to just go ahead and make it look a little bit nicer. It is a gift, it's for a kid, but I do want it to look nice. So I practiced drawing some hearts, I made a little stencil, and I drew that out with pencil, then I outlined it with my Sharpie marker. It wasn't as even as I wanted, so I went ahead and hit it with a thicker Epiphany XB Chrome in a 6 size, and that made them a little bit more even. There's still some oopses in certain areas, but it's okay. It looks better than it did before I did that, and it certainly looks better than my hodgepodge of random heart shapes up at the top. The next step is going to be erase it with a standard eraser. I did just use an H pencil, so these are lighter pencil lines anyways. But once you add the watercolors, any pencil lines will be sealed into the project, and I'd like these to not show. So I'm going to go ahead and erase most of these marks. I'll leave the lines at the top and the side because I'm going to want to cut this out later. But everything on the inside can come up. Okay, that's done. Oops, a little bit more. And I'd say we're ready to paint. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start. I do like the arrangement of the colors that I used originally, so we'll go ahead and keep that the same. thinking on it, I am going to leave out my little metallic heart, just because that color isn't going to be included in the set, and I don't want to include my niece should she go to look for something that isn't there. Maybe I'll do a border in that or something, but the actual swatches are going to include just what paints are in the kit, as it should. The rest of that color chart I finished off camera, but here is a close-up of what it looks like when I finished it. I'm really glad I redrew the color chart with hearts that look all the same shape. Made a little template for those and I think it turned out great. It really shows off the 20 colors that my niece is going to get in this gift palette, and I'm sure she has enjoyed using this set. It's a wonderful variety of colors. If you haven't played with the Marie's watercolors, I highly recommend it. It's a great way to get into this medium without spending a lot on the paints. So here we are, the final chart for the Miejllo palette pour. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching this video. I hope you all have a great art-filled day. See you in the next video.